Hello, everyone. I have 1 o'clock, and so my name is Jeff Horan. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Forest Ecology Working Group, and I'm the moderator for the Forest for the Birds webinar series. So thank you so much for coming. Today's actually the 12th and final installment of our 12-part series, Forest for the Birds. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Bill Uline from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when he talks about our changing way of working is revolutionizing conservation. Now, I'm going to turn things over to Shannon Connors, who is our National Conservation Training Center host. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thanks, Jeff. The Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series is jointly sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center, Forest Ecology Working Group, and Migratory Bird Program. And we'll share this information in the chat box if you're interested in learning more about the Forest Ecology Working Group, or if you'd like to receive continuing education credits for attending these webinars. And just a quick disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. And I will turn it back over to Jeff to introduce our speaker. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Shannon. Again, my name is Jeff Horan. I'm a forest ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Forest Ecology Working Group, and that is one of the sponsors of this series. And as I mentioned, today is the last webinar in our 12-part Forest for the Birds series, and I wanted to thank each of you, the participants, and our speakers for making this a successful series. And again, it has been sponsored by our Forest Ecology Working Group, the National Conservation Training Center, and the Migratory Birds program within Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Migratory Bird Program is pleased to be co-sponsoring this webinar series as part of the Partners in Flight celebration of 30 years of conservation. And so quickly, before I introduce Bill, I need to mention just a few things. As Shannon said, we're going to be trying to engage you, and we'll stop probably halfway through for questions, but Bill also has a poll he wants to try to run with us, just to give you a chance to provide a little bit of input. So we'll be trying that today. And finally, since this is the last of our Forest for the Birds webinar series, I did want to run a quick commercial for our next webinar series called the Forest Climate Adaptation webinar series. And this series is sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we have also partnered with the U.S. Forest Service's Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And the purpose of this new webinar series is to increase the understanding of climate impacts on forest ecosystems, including composition, structure, and climate dynamics, and to share tools and management approaches to help facilitate forest and wildlife habitat adaptation at the landscape and stand scales. But before we start that series, we do have a special webinar kind of in between, and that's going to be held next month, which is on March 15th, and this will be with Kurt Johnson and Sarah Ward from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're going to be speaking on the service's climate change action program and nature-based solutions. And again, that will be on March 15th, and then our full new webinar series on forest climate adaptation will start on April 19th. And we'll send, and you folks are on our webinar list, so you'll be hearing from us. So now to introduce Dr. Bill Uline. Dr. Uline serves as the South Atlantic, Gulf, and Mississippi Basin Assistant Regional Director of Conservation Science and Innovation, or CSI. You guys thought that was something else. CSI is the combined powerhouses of the Fish and Wildlife Service's migratory bird and science application programs. Bill says his background and love of outdoors came from working with his dad, the foreman, on several ranches in Wyoming, California, and New Mexico. He earned a bachelor's and a master's degree in biology from Eastern New Mexico University and a PhD from Mississippi State University. Bill's service career has been in migratory birds, serving as science coordinator and eventually the coordinator of the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture Partnership, and then in his current role of assistant regional director. Most of Bill's work experiences have centered on leadership, relationship building, and leveraging technical expertise in landscape assessment, ecosystem modeling, and monitoring for the full spectrum of migratory birds. Now for our speaker, Dr. Bill Uline. Bill, please tell us about our changing way of working is revolutionizing conservation. And again, thanks for being part of our series.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Really appreciate the introduction and super excited to be here. This is when I was asked to do this a year ago. It seemed pretty simple, like, sure, why not? But we all know what happens over a year. It was real interesting that Bob Ford, when he first talked a little bit about it, called it the road to recovery. We know there's been some discussions about what that means. I thought maybe a year from then we'd be able to look at the progress we've made, and I think we could. But by and large, I zoomed away a little bit and started thinking a little bit more about the changing way of working and how that is revolutionizing conservation. So I want to spend this time with you, talk a little bit about that, and challenge us, and in the end, ask you and your role in your organization about the adaptive capacity you have in terms of changing the way we do business. And the fact of the matter is it's happening whether we do anything or not. The conservation paradigm is changing. Question is what is our role and contribution to that? So let me dive into that and think about the changing way. What does that mean by the way of working challenge? There's both the technical advancements and then the adaptive advantage. And I'll talk a little bit more about that adaptive advantage here in a second. In terms of technical advancements, we've focused a tremendous amount over the past year on some of the technical advancements in conservation theory, digital revolution, and decision theory. All of those are really important for us to be able to address the magnitude of the challenges that we face. The adaptive advantage, and that's a phrase I'm using from a recent book called the Adaptation advantage, which I'll talk about in a second. Basically, it's where we're dealing with complex and ambiguously centered challenges. And I would say the 3 billion birds is one of these complex and in many ways ambiguous in terms of what we need to do. And then as we're engaging, we engage a broader and broader set of individuals and communities, which could potentially lead to volatile or unpredictable outcomes because of a clash of values, if you will, or at least some uncertainty and ambiguity in that. When we think about the adaptive challenges, we look at solutions that require people to learn new ways of doing things, change our attitudes, change our values. That's a threat to many of us. And then it also asks us to, the leaders of looking at the adaptive challenges as thinking more systematically, looking at the entire whole array of actors involved, and then seeking to understand the root causes, which requires committing time and energy, a commodity or a very important aspect of and limiting factor for all of us. So let's talk a little bit more. Let me dive a little bit deeper into this book, The Adaptation Advantage by McGowan and Shipley. If you have not read it or seen it, I encourage you to do it. They're not talking about conservation in and of itself. They're talking about the work at large, the future of work. And they talk about the changing in this fast changing pace that we have as we've got to look past our current way of working, our current identity, and look beyond the comforts of how and what we do and who we work with, and really think about how we're changing in the future of the way we work. McGowan describes and Shipley describe adaptability as it's the skill to handle ambiguity, to learn and unlearn in a changing environment. With that, they talk about 3 truths in terms of culture and transformation. Get ready for a poll. Digital transformation is actually human transformation. That's one of their truths. That transformation is continuous. It's not just one and done. It's not a single stage. And then flexibility is pivoting between existing tools and skills, where adaptation and adaptation requires learning and unlearning and trying new ways of doing work. So with that definition, very high level, I'm going to ask you to everybody to fill out a poll. Again, this could be a gut feeling. What is it's 2 questions on this. One is on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a highly adaptive, what do you think your personal adaptability is in terms of the changing? The second question in this poll asks you to consider that with your organization. How flexible or adaptable, really, not flexible, but adaptable, is our organizations and our institutions able to adapt to change? We'll leave the poll open for a minute. While I do that, there is a couple of links that I'll provide in this recorded webinar that you'll be able to go back and gain a little more insight in the adaptation advantage from some interviews that both authors have provided and are available on YouTube. All right, let's, if we can, Shannon, let's go ahead. This is not, we don't need an all-inclusive poll here. Let's see if we can take a look at some of the results. And can I modify this so I can take a look? All right, it looks like we feel pretty good with our own adaptability. 7 and 8 looks like the high, and our organization, it drops a little bit lower. And I realize this is a quick poll and we haven't really introduced the full concept of adapted, but we know that it is a challenge. So thank you for that. We'll move on. Thank you everybody for your participation there. Now let's take a little bit a dive here. What are we going to talk about today? Culture. This is adapted from the Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. It's basically speaks to culture is not something you are, it's something you do. And it's more specifically, it's a set of living relationships and the collective pattern of behavior working towards shared goal that defines our culture. And we can look at all kinds of different elements of that. Before we dive into it, I want to place it in context of what our hosts have done here. And again, I'm going to say thank you to NCTC, the Migratory Bird Program, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Ecology Working Group for sponsoring and putting this important webinar series on. At the beginning, we looked in and talked about the bird loss to recovery. We talked about conservation design and implementation from landscape scale to down to the site scale. We talked about and were introduced to a number of conservation initiatives that are out there, lots of them on the frontier. And we also talked about monitoring. We heard from folks on monitoring. This was not a comprehensive catch everything, but it was a good snapshot of all of the work that's ongoing with forest and birds. Finally, this is a wrap up. I'm wrapping things up. Many of what we talked about throughout and the presenters talked about a lot of the technical solutions and the technical advances that have been advancing in conservation and in the world at large, but they also talk about the important role and relationship of partners and partnerships at play in the different communities that are part of the solution. So here, 2 objectives. I'm going to highlight the ongoing rapid change that is occurring both technically and adaptive on the frontiers of adaptation, and it's happening much larger than conservation, obviously. And then I'm going to lean into your passions and your responsibilities as a conservationist, whether you're a forester, whether you're an administrator, whether you're private business, could be a NGO, federal, state organization, whatever you are. I want to think about and inspire you and motivate you to think about and be more intentional in bolstering your adaptability in the interest of sustainability. The responsibility of conservation and the sustaining of our natural resources is critical. And we've got to think about how we adapt to and move towards that direction. Again, looking at that culture, we're going to look at 3 social forces confronting and changing conservation that we're all involved in. Shared goals, I'm going to use that definition of culture, the shared goals, set of living relationships, and then the collective pattern behavior. I'll do it in a very quick way. I think there's a lot more introspection and thought needs to happen in all of these, but I wanted to tease it apart in this way because it does challenge our identity in the past as well as in the future. So let's dive in a little bit. into that, I want to introduce one other aspect here that put into all of y'all's mind, and that's this innovation, the idea of innovation, because I really believe that our ability to adapt as individuals and as organizations, and our ability to infuse innovation into finding these really tough solutions is imperative. And I use this, and I really like this innovation matrix. I'll use it as a couple of examples here in just a minute, just introduce the idea here. You can see that's illustrated. You have the problem definition and then the domain definition. And there's 4 quadrants of which kind of innovation that people have used to characterize innovation. All right, zooming back out. Here we come back in. We're going to start talking about the wrap up, shared goals. What brought us to this dance? What brought us to this dance was birds, but we all know, and our presenters have talked about it, that the challenges confronting the sustainability of our natural and cultural resources goes well beyond the 3 billion birds and the crisis of the 2019 identified in that 2019 paper. And there's so much change that we're all experiencing, and the COVID pandemic has just exacerbated and as McGowan has talked about, is used as an accelerant to the need for adaptation from the human aspect of that. So let's zoom out to shared goals. Look at our origin, if you will, in terms of North American model. And we can go all the way back to the Roman Empire. We're not going to talk about that in detail, but in the end, the fight over who owns fish, shorelines, and water, all the way back several thousand years ago, has a foundation in our culture, in our communities, where the private trust doctrine of fish and wildlife belong not to any individual, but are held in public trust for the benefit of people. So there's a public trust responsibility for fish and wildlife, and it's shared by state, federal, and tribal governments. Now, again, the shared goal, we're becoming more and more aware of, and this doesn't mean just the last couple of years, this is over a decade, is the idea that the natural resources and our way that we encounter them are very different from indigenous people of this country. And now we're starting to learn more, and there's documentation and there's publications on thinking about the North American model from different perspectives. All of those has us starting to think about the shared goal and what that means. And in the end, as that starts to evolve and our understanding grows, so too does this transformation in conservation and really the revolutionizing. So then let's think about then what the going into the early late 19th, early 20th century, where we overexploited all these natural resources, and the birth of many of our conservation enterprises today. Resource development was an economic imperative. Stewardship was a public responsibility. Natural resources were segmented and compartmentalized. And the practitioners, both the scientists and managers, trained in resource-specific disciplines. And our nation's private, state, federal, and tribal conservation infrastructure developed around this compartmentalized approach. So you can see on this graphic here, this little cartoon, that I have these little bubbles, if you will, of these natural resources. And those were, when we first started organizing around managing, we started organizing around those. When we start thinking about system sustainability, it challenges the fundamental way of doing business in that context. Just managing it is one thing. Another is the perpetuation in a much more integrated and interwoven system. How do we do that? It's a daunting challenge. We can look at all these compartments, and we can take and dissect these into many of them, but these are some of the primary segments and where we work. And each of these segments of our culture and our resource management has developed an adaptive management capacity. And I want you all to be thinking about this both as capacity and the adaptability of any one of these bubbles and the interconnection that we have. They're becoming much more sophisticated over time, where we've got an adaptive or the action cycle, the planning, implementation, evaluation, and it varies by, some of them are very robust, very large, some of them are very small, and struggling for resources to be able to complete the full cycle. But in the end, we've got a tremendous amount of capacity and capability within each of these, if you will, silos or these arenas. And it even gets more complicated than that. We're not going to dive into this. Here's a spaghetti figure, just picking out one resource and all of the web of interrelationships. This slide or graphic developed by Amy Keister. I love it. Spaghetti, if you will, spaghetti and meatballs. And it's a whole lot more complicated than just a circle. And then things get even more fuzzy and complicated when we start thinking about climate. And we've seen models where the adaptive management cycle has added a couple of other components when we have so much uncertainty in the future of climate change. So thinking about all of that and where we've come and our maturation as conservationists within each of these arenas is understanding they're all interwoven, they're interrelated, and that translates into an interdependency, especially agencies and organizations and individuals that are working within each of these individual communities. Let's peel away some of that complexity. Let's peel away again a little bit more, and let's just focus in and zoom in on the two worlds that brought us here today. That's forest and birds. The traditional approach would be that the bird community, if you will, would develop best management practices, throw it across the fence over to the foresters and the other sectors and say, hey, these would be wonderful things to do. And the forestry would be talking about the different forest management techniques and the different outcomes and the mosaic of a forested system, the public, private, and state. And we would draw from that in the bird world, and they would draw the bird world. And then what we're now doing is forging new relationships. And as we forge new relationships, and I would submit that the Forest Ecology Working Group is an example of looking not just simply as one or the other, but looking at the interrelationships and thinking about the shared goals. We've heard some other presenters that said the Darrens, if you will, or Randy with the desired forest conditions. They talked about it's not just simply developing best management practices, but the dialogue and coming together to really think about the interrelationships. So as we think about the shared goals, that changes the relationship and how we relate to each other, and ultimately moves us in a different direction in conservation. So I'm going to use a case study here that many of you are familiar with, but I really wanted to emphasize this relative to the adaptive challenge that we've encountered before, and we need to counter again on a whole new level. And I'm going to use this infusion of innovation matrix. Now, I'm going to go back to the late 1970s, early 80s, when the waterfowl populations were crashing and everybody in the waterfowl community wanted to do something, knew they had to do something. The problem definition was well-defined, a crashing waterfowl population. The domain definition was a little bit challenging. There was a well-developed flyway system, a continent-wide flyway system. Yet that domain was mostly in the regulatory hunting regulations and not in the implementation as it relates to conservation actions, connecting lands and waters. And so there was a well-defined problem, and you can see there a not well-defined domain, which led to a breakthrough in innovation from my perspective. That 1986 North American Waterfowl Management Plan, super simple, 19 pages is all it was, but it was and has transformed and impacted significantly the conservation in North America, certainly birds, but at large. And there's still a lot of evolution to come. But three main pieces came out of that: the explicit objectives. We need this many waterfowl to meet the desired levels of the 70s. We're gonna need to focus and concentrate our conservation actions within these geographies where we know are really important for breeding, migration, and overwinter. And then it introduced this thing called a joint venture. I don't think it was capitalized then. I think it was lowercase and bottom line. If you look at the language in there, it really is more about cost sharing projects and working together. Well, guess what? What happened was it created an environment where all of the players within each of these landscapes came together and started working together towards the common outcomes and delivering conservation actions within those. That was super exciting. All in a very short period, other bird initiatives were emerging because of some of the major challenges that were confronting all suites of birds. And so the Partners in Flight initiative and shorebirds and water birds. Well, the question is where do they fit in this? And the problems were well defined, but the domain didn't exist. There were a lot of challenges, lines. Everybody had different lines. I won't get into the details there, but in the end, breakthrough, instead of a breakthrough solution, there was more of a disruption innovation where all of the different bird communities came to the joint venture partnerships and said, hey, would you be willing and able to implement and deliver for all birds? And now we have a wall-to-wall, continent-wide network of joint venture partnerships. Now, are they where they would like to be individually or collectively? No, there's lots of work to be done there, but that is a tremendous amount of change that occurred, and I would say largely an adaptive change in the way we work together. And guess what? We're still evolving. With the 2019 paper and the highlight in the huge decline in grasslands, the joint ventures, 8 joint ventures in our grassland systems came together and created a JV8. Again, it's looking for that next level of adaptability that's needed in order for us to sustain these, because these joint ventures have been operating in that landscape as independent, self-directed partnerships. How do we actually come together? And they're not the Lone Rangers in the grassland, as we all know, lots of other things, but this is a good example of that adaptive challenge. All right, let's get back to where we are today. The Forest Ecology Working Group, desired forest conditions, we talk about the land bird, and I want to mention one thing. Why does this matter? When we think about the shared goals, going from waterfowl to all birds to broader partners and partnerships, it asks us, what are the technical and adaptive capacities that are needed for you and your organization as shared goals continue to evolve and reflect the interrelationship inherent in sustaining natural resources? It's a question I want you to think about, and in the end, I'm going to ask you to take that home and think a little bit more. And I want to very clearly here note, when I talk about a change in shared goals, it does not replace the individual organization's missions, authorities, or mandates. Ducks Unlimited is an organization that will stay focused on waterfowl. That's its job, that's its mandate, that's its authorities, its business model. But what it does, though, is it helps us start thinking about the interrelationships and the interconnected relationships and provides a context for implementing actions that are exercised through our individual agencies and organizations. So when we hear the concern, and I'll talk about this concern a little bit here in a second, about the identity and our concern with our loss of identity, there is some reality there, but there's also the comfort in knowing that our unique roles and responsibilities and niches don't necessarily change, even as we broaden the overall shared goals of thinking about things in context of sustainability. I'll use a couple of more examples and then we'll move on to the next piece here. A thriving land, so we look at the Midwest Landscape Initiative. This is a major, another level, if you will, another layer of a mega partnership. Same thing with the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, led by the Regional Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and joined by others. You can see that the vision and the emerging goals are broad. And all of a sudden it starts questioning, well, who needs to be involved in that? If we're actually going to achieve this, there's more and more players that become and are part of the equation and table. So with that, I'll look to you, Jeff, and see if we have time for pause or if we just need to advance depending on our timing.
Bill, I think you're doing fine. So we can pause for a few questions. So if folks are nimble with their fingers and they have questions, I can take maybe one or two as they come in, and then so we all can just take a breath here for a second and go ahead and ask questions if you have them. I'll also say that in the chat, I did put a link to all of our recordings. They're now available on the Partners in Flight website. All 12 of our recordings will be available there. So there's already a question in from Sharon, and it's, how do you see the adaptive process play out with individual factions or groups within factions who do not agree with a shared goal?
That is a great question, Sharon, and I'm going to talk about that at the very last slide. I think it makes it when we're talking about resources that have an interdependent or an interwoven relationship ecologically, economically, then our resistance as an individual, as an organization, I think potentially moves us on this down the spectrum of relevancy towards irrelevant. As we become more insular and less able to be identified by the broader society, it pushes our organization and us individually towards that irrelevance. I think as we strive towards relevance, it's because we're becoming more engaged, because we're engaging more and more sectors of society. So my perspective is that there's a huge risk both in the resources that we're responsible for, but also in the relevancy of our future. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And so if you're quick, we have one more from Andy, and this one I think is also relevant. How are citizen scientists affecting current activities, and how do we mobilize these partners for the greatest benefit?
Yeah, that's awesome. I think I have underutilized, but it's a field that's emerging, and I think we're getting better at it. I think as what we do though, and the challenge that we face, and I'll talk about this in a second here, is that we do this silo by silo, our own little worlds. We reach out to citizen scientists, which is good and great, but how do we actually take all of our collective responsibilities and think about really mobilizing a larger set of citizen scientists to be engaged, because it's their values, it affects their values, their perspectives, and our relevancy because of their values, gives us additional data and input to that we can incorporate into our decision making. Yes, recognizing all of the caveats with biases and uncertainties, etc. But by and large, it's a huge data source for us to glean from, but also that relationship building and growing the voices and participants in the actions and activities that we're responsible for.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, this series is really based on 50 years worth of what to a large degree is citizen science with eBird. It's not completely, but a lot of it is. So with that, Bill, I'll let you run with stuff, and I will invite folks to put questions in the chat box because we will try to take a few at the end. So thanks.
Great, thanks. So let's dive a little in, shift a little bit into the second piece there, a set of living relationships. I'm going to be much shorter on this, as well as the last one, the collective pattern of behavior, but this is crucial, the set of living relationships. So let's go again and look at just these two worlds that we're talking about here in the intersection between the birds and the forest. And again, traditionally, it would have been continue to work within our own individual silos. We're going to build and work and communicate and dialogue within those that share our responsibilities and learn from and grow from. And sorry about that. I saw something pop up here on a notification. I want to make sure I didn't lose connection. And so our relationships are defined pretty tight. The great question a minute ago with our citizen scientists, there is a relationship there, even though it might be tangential, it's still there. As we continue to look at this intersection between integration and that emerging relationship, and how we work with each other changes the very essence of the relationship. It's not just here's some BMPs, please go do it. Let's figure out how to have a sustainable forest management system that both takes care of the forest production or the forest products, if you will, or whatever the objectives are, as well as our other natural and cultural resources that share that same landscape. So the living relationships, here's a couple of links. This is recorded, so you don't have to write them down or screen capture. You can if you want, but you'll be able to come back in here. And I encourage you to do that as your interest and time allow as it relates to the adaptation advantage presented in this book. They give you a little bit more. I'm just going to grab a couple of pieces from a presentation that they gave at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Management conference, AFWA conference recently. It talks of when we think about relationships, it's not just relationships in different camps, it's also relationships within our organization and across society at large. And it uses one example here of multiple generations and the different way we see the world through these different generations. As an example, work is going to the silent baby boomers, long-term career, adventure to retire, and then Gen X, a job, a contract. This is generalization, we recognize that, and then we get to millennial. It's a means to an end. It's really the value. And then entrepreneurial purpose. Even Peter Drucker, the great management theorist, talked about the new management, the 21st century management will be really less about the hierarchical command and control organization, but really the knowledge worker and the mobility of the knowledge worker. They can move from any one of those silos that I had all around. They are not centered and come to that production line and work there for 30 years. So there's that aspect of living relationships, not just between the different worlds, but within our organization and society at large. Another dimension is the identity, and they refer to it as identity theft. Threats. Here's why they describe it as threats. The way they characterize it is that our ability to adapt is much more difficult when our identity is, or the perception of our identity is under threat. And that goes back, I think, to the question that both our individuals asked a few minutes ago. When we start thinking about our shared values or our shared goals, if there is a threat or a perceived threat to that identity, our willingness and interest to adapt is compromised. It just is. Our society is changing rapidly, and here's where they present a number of this. It doesn't make one wrong or right. It just makes things challenging. Who we are, what we do, and where and how we go about the work. Human relationships used to be face-to-face. 50 to 80% of the time, it's now online. That is part of where we work. We're not just within our populations, our community, but it's much broader than that. We are much more. And as we move towards diversifying the conservation of agencies and organizations and how we're engaging, it's going to change our identity. It's going to threaten our identity. It won't necessarily change it. It will certainly threaten it. But if we can start thinking about our identity less about our current organization and structure and more about what we're about and that system sustainability for those individual first resources, we can start seeing our ability through that crisis. Now, the living relationship, I wanted to go back to the example I put out there and just the power of this. Again, these are forces that are changing conservation overtly. We may not be really aware of it, but they are. I look at the North American Waterfall Management Plan as another example of this. And you all are familiar with many examples like that. Just using these as an example to get your minds thinking about it, and let's all be on the same page. Go to the North American Waterfall Management Plan, the beginning of the joint ventures. I don't know, and Justin, thank you for this data here. I don't know if what the full collection of partners that sit around a joint venture management board that own the responsibility of implementing the goals and objectives of the North American Waterfall Management Plan, but it was a finite set. State, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, no doubt, state fish and wildlife agencies, the provinces of Canada, Ducks Unlimited, Delta Waterfowl, maybe a few others. But in the end, it wasn't huge. Now, if you look at these wall-to-wall joint ventures, there's 155 or something like that management board. This isn't the partnerships that happen on the ground. This is people that sit down at the table and share the responsibility of implementing the goals and objectives of the national and international bird plans within those respective geographies. It's huge. And I pulled out some examples. Look at that. Pet care. We got mosquito and vector control. What? Think about the values. Think about the shared goals. Think about the relationship, the living relationships we're talking about. When these communities come together with a shared sense of responsibility, focused on this case on implementing the goals and objectives of the national and international bird plans within those geographies. That in and of itself changes the living relationship, which has and is revolutionizing conservation. That's not all. Guess what? We talked about a minute ago about the traditional knowledge network and the value and the way other sectors of our society, the indigenous people and their relationship with nature. What does that look like, and how does that influence our living relationship? That identity we talked about in the future and the relevancy. Diversity isn't just simply race or gender. It is a way of thinking. Each of us, all of us contribute to a diverse perspectives, and we need to bring more of those in. And as we do that, as we start thinking about our way of working and who's involved in our way of working, will and is revolutionizing conservation. Ironically, within each of these silos and our bubbles and relationships, many of us are trying to tackle the clear deficit in diversity and inclusion, making a lot of strides. A ton more have to be made. We all recognize and know that. Can we adapt in a way that's more comprehensive and inclusive collectively instead of each individual agency, organization, program can we come together and really become a more robust community and think about how we become a more inclusive community and culture? All right. Collective patterns of behavior. This is the last piece I'll touch on here. So the primary change in our behavior is the internet. How many relationships have we encountered and broadened over this past 2 years? This has not been cut since March 6, 2002 or 2020. Tons have happened since then in terms of digital level. But guess what? Our patterns have changed to be more online. But here's a poll for you. I'm going to ask you this question. Let's be real. Let's be bold. What else have you been doing since we started this? Shannon, if we can get that other poll popped up there. All right, let's be honest. Tell me, what have you been doing? What other multitasking? We know it. That's part of our pattern of collective pattern of behavior. We're all super busy, jammed up. This is something we are doing and it's important to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. But what else have you been doing? We'll wait for a couple of minutes. I will say that as we're waiting for you to think of, and I know you've already thought of it, you probably want to do multiple choice here instead of just one. It's like, oh man, well, which one more than the other? Anyway, the digital revolution and our ability to engage with each other has just transformed and is advancing our ability to as conservation. Think about how we're engaging and who all we're engaging with each other on a whole nother level. And then beyond our traditional, if you will, colleagues in our organizations and well beyond. I know I've participated in a number of workshops that we would not have had before as it relates to working with minority and underrepresented private landowners. Super exciting, and that's only going to blossom. All right, let's take a look at the Shannon, the results, and see if people were, yep, that's what I had. Look at that, man. There's a few of you that are solely focused on this. But most people are really busy, and we all know that. How do we affect, and as we're in, thank you, Shannon, for that. How do we think about our pattern of behavior and when and how and where we engage in our behaviors? That is just one example. There are, let me get back to Another set of behaviors that I wanted to walk through real quick as it relates to the technical, and it's then and now. Planning from the beginning was very closely focused on the activities and our administration responsibilities and our programs. There are a lot of them opportunity-based. As we're moving further and further along in this evolution of conservation towards conservation science and system sustainability, it's very outcome-oriented, model-based, spatially explicit, multi-scaled and predictive implementation, protection, restoration, and management pursued as the end. How many acres, how many miles, how many partners have we implemented? And opportunities prioritized at the landscape scale. Implementation as this evolution, protection, restoration, and management pursued as a means, and ultimately the opportunities prioritized against landscape scale assessment. Where is the outcome we're trying to achieve, whether it's a interior forest breeding bird objective, it matters where placement is on that landscape. Monitoring evaluation. We've looked at that in large, and we still do, as an operational luxury. It comes at the inherent good of implementation of putting conservation on the ground. And it's just looked at as an element of research, where when we're outcome-based, very explicit, when we're making assumptions about the sustainability of these actions to the species that we're responsible for, then it becomes a much more essential and integrated structure in the adaptive decision process. Finally, research, prioritize or derive periodic calls. Hey, this is USGS. What are your science needs? This is the research center. Whereas the conservation science, it looks at aimed at testing the underlying assumptions. We're assuming these are the limiting factors for these species. This forest management composition, the desired forest condition, we're making the assumptions that if we manage this way, both at the site scale and the landscape scale, it's going to have that outcome of sustaining the species that we're responsible for. Did we get it right? Did we not? Those are the assumptions we need to test. Those are all part of the pattern of evolution or pattern of change that is happening. I wanted to mention this. We're changing this. It's part of our culture and part of our future. Again, we're doing it a lot by silos, if you will, within our individual organizations, within our sub-activities of our organizations, and it becomes incredibly complicated when we're starting to work together towards a common outcome. How? Whose role, responsibilities? Those are still things that we're trying to work out together. So part of this evolution, the collective pattern of behavior, if we go back to the beginning, if you will, the beginning of the 20th century, where we had the overexploitation, we were really focused on regulation, game management, forest management on the regulation side. We've moved towards a thing called conservation without conflict. How do we work collectively and collaboratively together, moving from a competitive model to a collaborative model where we're seeking these outcomes. These three pieces up here in the top left of your screen, that's from, again, McGowan and Shipley. Now the future of work is rapid learning, unlearning. Can we really unlearn that? It's so hard, isn't it? And then that adaptation, let go of the way we've always done it. We feel like we're doing that, but that is super hard to do. And then more important, equally it says, but more difficult, is who we think we are, that identity. What is our identity and that threat to our identity, and how that has implications to our ability to adapt so that we can, in fact, address the 3 billion bird crisis. So we can, in fact, address this huge challenge that we have in terms of biodiversity, both within the continental US, but also North America or globally. I'll leave kind of in before my last slide here with this quote, or this quote from General Stanley, which I think is really, really important in thinking about who we are and what we do. Getting to know your colleagues intimately and acquiring a whole system overview of big time sink. Oh man, that is exhausting. It really is. What I'm doing here is a whole lot harder, and thinking about and asking you to think about it a whole lot harder than it is many of the other tasks that we have to do. And sharing of the responsibilities through a joint venture partnership, through these large partnerships, whether it's keeping forest, or many of these partnerships that are across the country. it creates redundancies. But this overlap and redundancy, says General Stanley, is these efficiencies are precisely what imbues teams with higher level adaptability and efficiencies. When we acknowledge that, when we understand that, when we seek to focus on that outcome, the end game, the goal, now we start thinking about roles and responsibilities and how we're working together and how we contribute and who else needs to be part of these solutions. Great teams are less like awesome machines and more like awesome organisms. Work as a network leverage partnership. So with that, I will close and leave you with a request. I would like each and every one of you to figure out some way to zoom out and away from everything you do and all of the actions and activities and our full plates, and think about what adaptive innovation actions can you take to shape the future of conservation. And think about it. You can under these 3 ways that I've introduced it here, but there are many different ways of looking through the lens here. Through shared goals, what does that mean? And how does that impact the adaptive innovation that we might need to be thinking about? Set of living relationships. And it's not just a contract, but the actual living relationship that we have with other individuals within our culture and our institutions of conservation, but beyond the private landowner, the working lands, the organizations of businesses and infrastructure. And you saw some of those on the joint venture. And ultimately, your organizations. And what about the conservation enterprise at large? And this gets back to the response I had a minute ago to the question where the relevancy spectrum, where and how are we relevant? If we don't make some of these adjustments and adapt the way we're doing work, I submit that we will slide down that relevancy spectrum towards irrelevance. If we're not relevant, we're irrelevant, or we're only relevant to a few, yet our responsibilities transcend our operational footprint and requires us to work at different levels. So we have to think about moving along that continuum where that relevancy is broad, whether it's congressional, whether it's the public at large, businesses. We're all interdependent in terms of sustaining our natural and cultural resources, and sliding ourselves along that relevancy continuum and spectrum is very vital from my opinion. And with that, Jeff, I will conclude. Thank you everybody for your time. I really appreciate it. And I will turn it over to you, Jeff, for whatever happens next.
Hey, Bill, thanks for a great presentation, and thanks for making us think deeply about some of these things and the universe in which we work. So we have time for a few more questions. So we still have about 7 minutes. So there is a question here from Brenda McComb, who's part of our forest ecology working group. And so she asks, forest management for habitat for selected species or biodiversity conservation has been the goal of the forest ecology working group. What role should educational systems, so at our National Conservation Training Center and at our universities, what role should they play in bringing forestry and wildlife biology, those 2 silos, together to solve and address wildlife habitat management challenges and to address habitat management goals?
Yeah, great questions. I think my initial response to that would be that number one is to acknowledge they are independent resources in some way, but understand and recognize the interdependence at play, and not look at them as 2 separate resources, but as an interrelated system. And think about how and where it's not just simply the stand scale, but it's the entire landscape. And how do we think about working across multiple? I think the Randy Wilson gave with the desired forest condition, that it's not just the management of a stand, but the management of a stand within a larger landscape. And so training, I think, both on the techniques, but also on the interrelationship. Another element, I think, of training, and that's for the implementation, another element of training, I think, is testing the underlying assumptions. Are we right? Are these valid? Are we getting the response that we're after? And especially as we think about it broadening in we're managing forest, not just for interior forest or forest birds, but for other fish and wildlife. We're also managing it for other responsibilities or interests, such as the private landowners' objectives. So I think all of those are really important elements to bring into a training that speaks to the interrelationship and interdependence of that and how we manage like an ecosystem.
Thanks, Bill. That's great. And so there are a couple questions coming in. So I have one for you that I think, Bill, might be in your wheelhouse. And you mentioned the joint ventures that grew out of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan back in '86. And one of those outgrowths, I think, from the bird joint ventures was really the landscape conservation cooperatives that kind of that were shepherded by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they really had that landscape perspective. And I think there were like 24 of them across the whole country, and they were very effective in the Northeast and Southeast, and to some degree, I think, in Alaska. And they really looked at conservation design, and bringing together all these partners. But they kind of left the stage because, really from a political standpoint. And again, we have all these joint ventures together, but there's no one really to bring them all together. How do you see, how do we implement conservation design at broad landscapes that allow us to then coordinate actions at a local level, particularly for things like, complexities of bird management, when birds' life cycles, really span numerous of these joint ventures?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, there's lots of theories and ideas in terms of the rise and fall of LCCs, landscape conservation cooperatives. I think by and large, it was at least the architects, if you will, were huge fans of joint venture partnerships and really were hoping that it would be the next evolution of joint ventures. But it was a sudden thing. It happened through the feds because of funding all of a sudden showed up. And I think a lot of it was the ability to adapt to the change. And it was very competitive, or it looked like a federal overreach. And bottom line is it was an attempt to help us move along. I think what we do is, we take that innovation matrix, and I look at what the JV8 has done. I know Murmuring in the mid JVs, I think it's Central Hardwoods, East Gulf, Lower Mist, and Oaks and Prairies have come together and thinking about that. We don't have the solution right now. We don't, as a society, we don't. I think our state wildlife action plans provides us a great opportunity to do that when we start weaving across. We also look at the forest sector, and forest sector has their forest, state forest action plans. How do we interweave these together? The AFWA came up with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies have a resolution that really speaks to how we relate to each other, but there is no governance or structure for that. I don't know that we need to impose that, but we do need to zoom out and think about where in this spectrum for JVs, I think it lies largely in that disruptive innovation, because we're all working super hard in there. And I think the JVs in the grasslands looked and said, hey, we're kicking butt within each of these, but collectively, how are we doing? So it disrupted a little bit, and somewhat it just added to, as opposed to total disruption. Challenges. We all need to challenge what we're doing, who we are, and what we're doing, not to bust things up, but to think about how we need to evolve and get better.
All right. So on your don't bust things up. Here's one from Catherine, and she says, wow, what a thought-provoking presentation. What is your advice when working in an agency culture where managers and / decision makers are very much in the then zone?
Let's get more of the now zone. I think a lot of it is maybe the then is fixed and immobile. I think a lot of the fixed and immobility is due to the pressures and the reactive nature of conservation. There's a lot of litigation and issues that confront our state fish and wildlife agencies, the federal organizations, that pull the power and energy away from thinking about the new way of doing business and get centered on survival mode. We've got to be able to zoom away and find some time to really get away from the day-to-day tyranny of the inbox and think about this collectively.
Thanks, Bill. So it is 2:00, and so we have exploited your time, and hopefully everyone enjoyed this. And again, thanks so much for your participation in our series. People have been great, and you've shared a lot of great comments. So I will just remind folks, I want to thank Bill for his great presentation today, and just remind folks that we are going to start a new series, and it's called Forest Climate Adaptation. And it will start in April, but next month on March 15th, we do have a special presentation, and that's on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Climate Change Action Program and Nature-Based Solutions. So I hope you can join us then on March 15th at 1:00. And again, we'll be sending out flyers for that and for the upcoming series. So thanks to all the participants, and thanks to all the speakers, and a big thank you to Bill Uline. Thanks for a thought-provoking presentation. Thanks to all, and have a great day.